Good afternoon. If you could all take your seats, we're going to start our next panel. Good afternoon. My name is Lisa Rayula. I'm Program Director at Metro Chicago Exports, a public-private partnership that focuses on increasing Chicago's international trade. I'm a recipient of the Aspen General Scholarship for the 2017 Forum, and I'd like to thank the Homeland Security Program for this amazing opportunity. Our next session is titled, Is NATO Up to the Challenge of the New World Order? The Kremlin has never been more aggressive and overt about its aim to undermine NATO. At the same time, there are epic threats from terrorism to cyber attacks facing the alliance. Is an alliance that has been the bedrock of the international order for 70 years capable of rising to these modern challenges? Moderating this session is Gordon Corera. Gordon is a security correspondent for BBC News, where he covers national security, intelligence, and homeland security issues for TV, radio, and online. He has presented a number of documentary series for the BBC, most recently on subversion and the role of the relationship between Russia and the West. He is also the author of 2 best-selling books. Please welcome Gordon.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. This is my first time in the beautiful surroundings of Aspen. Now, I'm guessing that if I'd come here 5, 6, 7 years ago, a bit like the conferences in Europe, there would have been a session on NATO in which basically the subtext would have been, what's NATO for these days? Does it really have a purpose? And you could sense this idea of NATO almost casting around, looking at out-of-area operations, getting involved in Afghanistan, maritime piracy, other issues, as it sought that role in the post-Cold War era. These days, I think there are far fewer people saying, what's NATO's purpose? But more people asking, is NATO fit for its purpose? Is it up to a new challenge? And the new challenge is partly based on the return of an old adversary in the face of Russia. But as well as the new set of challenges that NATO is trying to deal with, international people flows and terrorism, and this old adversary, and with the issue of tanks and aircraft, fighter jet once again, intercepting and flying close to each other over the borders, you've also got the new challenges of hybrid warfare. How does an alliance based on deterrence, on the idea of having men and metal ready to deter or to meet Russian invasion work in an era of hybrid warfare, of grey zones below warfare, in which perhaps it's not tanks coming over the border, but information and propaganda, or perhaps cyber attacks striking neighbouring states and then spilling over into NATO states? These are some of the challenges for NATO and some of the challenges we're going to be discussing in the next hour with the panel I've got here. You might notice from the programme that we don't have, sadly, the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine, who was unable to get to Aspen, I think for reasons we can understand. There's quite a lot going on in her country. But we do have 3 excellent panelists, all ambassadors, so I'm going to be referring to them by their first name rather than going ambassador, because it'll get too confusing otherwise. On my far right, we have Freytag von Arndt Freytag von Loringhoven, NATO's Assistant Secretary-General for Intelligence and Security. Then next to him we have Piotr Wilczek, the Ambassador of Poland to the United States, and next to me Peter Wittig, who is the Ambassador of Germany to the United States. Now let me just start by quickly asking them all how each of you, starting with Arndt, how effectively do you think NATO has adapted to this new challenge in this new world?
So 2014 was a major turning point for NATO with the Russian invasion in eastern Ukraine, annexation of Crimea, and ISIL attacks. And this caused a massive process of adaptation of NATO. We have seen the biggest increase in collective defense since the end of the Cold War. Enhanced forward presence in the Baltic region, tailored forward presence, a 40,000 strong NATO response force. We're developing a cyber policy. There's a cyber pledge. Cyber is now a NATO domain. We have the 2% defense spending gap, which we will probably come back to at a later stage. And let me just mention here that since then, it was not only a declaratory turning point, but a real turning point, because since then, European and Canadian allies have been contributing more every year in terms of defense spending. Now, you pinpointed to a major difference in the security environment, hybrid and cyber, and I would also say the multitude of potential crises, because NATO was designed to address one major adversary, a military potential military war with the Soviet Union, and now we have to deal with a lot of things at the same time. So I think we are in the midst of this adaptation process. We will need to do much more on the hybrid and cyber front to understand the challenge better, and also to develop a response there. And we have to, we are at the moment in the process of reviewing the command structure of NATO. And finally, terrorism, of course, is seen as a very big issue for NATO as well.
And your position is a new position, Assistant Secretary-General for Intelligence. Is that partly reflective of this need to bring more intelligence to the NATO political and military leadership faster than it's been before, when you've got potentially Russia acting very quickly in places like Ukraine and Crimea, really before often Western countries have understood what's going on?
Absolutely. I think there were two major reasons for this intelligence reform, which is why I'm here. NATO decided to create an intelligence and security division and to create this new post of Assistant Secretary General. One was to kind of streamline the intelligence picture that came out of the civilian and the military intelligence analysts, because sometimes they were duplicative, sometimes they didn't come to the same conclusions. So the military committee and the NATO Council were fed with different analyses that had to change. But also, I think the nature of the threat, the hybrid threat necessitates a common intel picture. And so there's a much greater appetite by nations for intelligence analyses now.
Piotr, let me move on to you. What's the view from Poland, which is on the front lines effectively for this new conflict?
Yes, Poland now is in a very, very special situation on the eastern flank. Actually, when I attended a few days ago an event celebrating Montenegro joining NATO, it's the most recent, new country in NATO. I was thinking about this battle of Poland and the Czech Republic and Slovakia to join NATO in the late 90s. So, and I was thinking about the difference. First of all, at that time, we were not thinking about the Cold War. The Cold War seemed like to be over. There was, of course, a kind of this one single major threat, but on the other hand, our idea, in Poland and in Central European countries, was just to join a very strong military alliance, to be stronger together. Now, with Montenegro joining NATO, it's different, because first of all, we just saw in 2014 how efficiently Russia can work if they decide to do what they did in Ukraine, in Crimea. They are very, very efficient. Their intelligence, their military. So we could see how it worked, and now we have all these other threats, also partly associated with Russia, but not only. Also global terrorism, and the second point is that the year 2008 was also important because of Georgia. So even earlier than in 2014, we could see how Russia can work, how can sort of blackmail other countries, how Russia made it more difficult for countries like Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO. So this is a completely new situation just after 15 years.
Do you worry not just about a kind of deliberate hybrid warfare move by Russia, but actually miscalculation and escalation? Just recently we've had, you had, I think, a Polish jet intercept a plane with the Russian defense minister on board, and then a Russian jet came alongside. I mean,
Exactly, yeah.
things are happening pretty fast on the ground and in the air in this case.
So things like that happen. Maybe they happened in the past as well. We didn't have so good journalists who
discovered
revealed that. So
would you
I
like to
think
tell us about some other incidents there?
such things happened, I think, all the time. But really, there is a great tension. When you asked about our position, there is a tension. There is this feeling of being surrounded. You may, for example, include in this story Kaliningrad, which is, I think, the most militarized, part of Europe, basically, bordering with Poland and Lithuania. The situation of the Baltics and Poland, and of course Ukraine. So, but now the situation is also different because of the decisions of the last NATO summit. I mean, the deployment of US and NATO troops, enhanced forward presence. This is also a kind of response of NATO on this very difficult situation. Mm-hmm.
Peter, how about you, the view from Germany? How well do you think NATO has adapted?
It's great to be here again at this beautiful Aspen Security Forum, and I'm honored to be on that panel. I think you're right. NATO is more relevant, more important than ever because of the new challenges and because of the new missions. Now, how is it doing? I think we've got to unpack it. First challenge from the East, the newly assertive Russia. I think NATO did pretty well. It reacted swiftly on that game-changing annexation of the Crimea, which basically meant the end of the post-Cold War order. It was stronger on defense and deterrence. It supported Ukraine. It supported by presence Southeast European countries. It's sometimes underrated, the Russian footprint in the Balkans. It deployed 4 battalion-sized battle groups in Poland and the Baltic states. Germany is leading one of them. And it spends more money. And I know you want to come back to that. I'm happy to talk about burden sharing. All in all, I think a great reaction. Let's not forget, it's not all about deterrence. It's also about dialogue with Russia. We want to pursue a 2-pronged approach here. It's good to keep the channels of communication with Russia open. We were instrumental in revitalizing that NATO-Russian Council that had been suspended after the annexation of Crimea. It's good to talk to Russia. We do that in this process of the Minsk process in discussing the Ukraine conflict. Second challenge from the South. Terrorism, migration, illicit trafficking of persons, the arc of instability from Syria to Libya. Here, NATO is still adapting. It's a new task. You have to react differently. No boots on the ground here massively, rather enabling our regional partners to do the fighting, project stability there, not only with military means, also civilian means. And here we don't want to duplicate what the anti-ISIL coalition is doing. So we've got to calibrate rightly what the NATO role in that arc of instability is. Third challenge, cyber warfare, hybrid warfare. Here, I think we are on a long trajectory. NATO reacted with the cyber defense plan in 2016. On hybrid warfare, we are not good at that. The West doesn't practice hybrid warfare, so we were a little surprised when Russia pulled out old tools from the Soviet era. And we have all our problems with that in our domestic political scenes. So, but here also important that member states of NATO increase resilience. And I want to add a fourth challenge, and that's Afghanistan, sometimes forgotten. We still have a mission to do there. We should not pull out, draw down the mission before the job is done. Otherwise, we'll see the return of the Taliban and the return of terrorism. It's important to be sustainably present there. I know that the US administration is about to take a decision on its presence. We want strong continued leadership there. So in a nutshell, I think NATO has done a good job in adapting. It is still our vital bedrock security in the West. And thanks to American leadership, and I hope it will continue, this has been the most successful defense alliance in recent history.
If I might add something, I think when speaking about American leadership, I think that's right now it's very important that the United States confirmed its commitment to NATO. That you asked about Poland. I'm very happy that President Trump, confirmed or acknowledged Article 5 in Warsaw during his speech in Warsaw. Of course, all these countries signed the treaty, so Article 5 is a part of this treaty, but after all these doubts during the campaign, it's very important for, I think, European and other allies to know that American leadership and is really is here.
Yeah, I mean, Article 5 is totemic
Yes.
for NATO, and I mean, during that Warsaw visit by the president, I mean, you could sense everyone waiting for the moment in which he would say it in the speech. Let me ask a slightly heretical question then, which is does Article 5 matter as much as it used to? What I mean by that is, obviously, it matters in the big scheme of deterrence. But if Russia is able to carry out hybrid warfare and carry out activity below the threshold of, if you like, which meets the traditional idea of a military attack, and is able to annex parts of countries, is able to carry out cyber attacks, and yet it never quite reaches the Article 5 threshold, then does deterrence still work? Have we found a way of NATO doing deterrence which is beyond the kind of Article 5? No.
I think that we should remember that the Article 5 was used for the first and only time at 9/11,
yeah.
9/11, which was not a traditional war, by the way. So it's, I think, quite a symbolic thing that it was then in 2001 that Article 5 was used in reaction to a non-typical
So
war.
it's got a symbolic role, Article 5, clearly, and a political role. But practically, how does NATO do deterrence then, if it's symbolic primarily?
But I think, first of all, Article 5 is really the essence of NATO for me. It's the unity and solidarity that's enshrined in that principle. It's the most important one, and as you said, it was never invoked in the Cold War, but it was invoked for the first time afterwards. So against a terrorist threat. Now we still have terrorist threats, so it is clearly still highly relevant. The really difficult issue will be hybrid, cyber, and Article 5 in the future. And NATO has already declared that a cyber attack could lead to the invocation of Article 5, but we haven't gone through the process. There's no doctrine, there's no command and control. So this is one of the really important political issues that we will have to develop very soon. And of course, in hybrid and cyber, the huge problem is the question of attribution. And you need that to invoke Article 5. So it's a very specific, extremely difficult situation. But it's very relevant, I would say.
Peter, let me ask you a bit about cyber as well. Germany's got elections coming up quite soon. The parliament got hacked, I think, 2 years ago, something like that. Mm-hmm. And it was attributed in many quarters to Russia. So some people wonder if emails might suddenly appear from that hack at some point, which could try and influence the elections. As you'll be aware, being an ambassador to Washington, that can create some news and have some implications. Has Germany kind of thought about that? Has it prepared a response? Has it thought about, because we heard in the previous session, had Washington really thought about deterrence and how it would respond and how to kind of communicate its response? Is that kind of thinking going on in Germany?
Well, I think we're thinking about it all the time. We have elections in 2 months. We've seen what happened in the US. We've seen what happened in France. We don't want to be yet another victim of foreign intrusion and meddling in our domestic political scene. Our domestic intelligence chief has said there is evidence of increasing Russian meddling in our political life. So we've seen that. in the hackings of the parliament, of political organizations. We've seen that in a propaganda that targeted Germans of Russian origin. We've seen that in a media setup, RT and other Russian media, and we've seen it in propaganda legends that were spread, including by high-level Russian officials. What is important is, of course, one, sort of cyber defense in terms of defending our infrastructure. I think we've been doing a lot there. The Army, by the way, has created a cyber defense as its own domain, but also the civilian infrastructure is, we try to protect it. Of course, it's penetrable, as all of them. But I guess even more important is the awareness of the people, of the population. The awareness that it happens is sort of a resilient against the impact of such cyber attacks or hybrid warfare. So I think that is the best defense in a way that people are aware that it happens, that they can decipher in a way the provenance and don't be fooled by fake news or by use of those cyber attacks. And I think that there the previous experiences in the US and France have helped.
Let me, let's tackle the difficult issue of money. 1.22%. Now, I think you know what that figure refers to. I think that's the percentage of GDP that Germany spends on defense. The target is 2%. When President Trump suggests that Europe has been free riding on American defense spending, he's got a point, hasn't he?
Well, this is not a new discussion. First of all, it emerged with the new challenges that we talked about, and we discussed this with the previous administration. And let me say up front, it's a legitimate discussion. And I think everybody agrees we've got to spend more on this, but we've got to have an honest discussion about it, and we've got to get the facts right. There are two things. I recall in this pivotal year, 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine. The leaders got together and decided the following. They said, we want to move incrementally over a decade to the goal of spending 2% of our GDP and have a share of 20% of our defense spending of investment. So over a decade, until 2014, we are called upon to reach the 2% goal. Not in a big bang, not in one day, incrementally. That's what we are doing. We raised our defense budget by 9% last year, and we are fully subscribing to that 2% goal. The 2% goal is not everything. It's about capabilities. It's about input to NATO. So let's, it's not just money. It's about participation in missions. We are in Afghanistan. We are in various other missions, and it is false to say that we are owing money to NATO or to the US. I mean, that is really that what...
Which was the suggestion coming from
well,
the White House.
but that's something that's just not correct, and that enrages Germans. Of course, we pay our share for the common costs of NATO, 15%. The US pays 22% for the organization, for the missions. Of course we do. And then there is this 2% pledge until 2024, and we are raising our expenditure. But that doesn't mean we owe anything to the US or to other partners. Those are two different things. But let me be very straight. We are doing more for defense. Europe has to do more. NATO, as I said before, is our vital security framework. We want to invest heavily there, politically, militarily, and financially. And you can take us by our word.
And just on the facts, if I may add, 2014 was really a turning point here, because until then, nations were spending less and less on defense, and we can see that starting in 2015, they spend more and more. This year, it'll be around 4.3% more. That's European allies and Canada. And we calculated that the sum of 46 billion is spent more on defense by European allies and Canada since 2015. So there's a clear trend changer.
Poland is among these few countries who reach this 2% on defense spending, but I agree, of course, that it's not only about numbers, but it's also about capabilities, about what we really do with this money, in the defense budget and how we use this money. So I think that the discussion is not that simple, that it's just about, but I agree that there are a few countries who already, have this 2%. So I think that's okay if we agreed to have it not, as you said, in 1 day or 1 month or 1 year, but it's both 2% and it's both about 2% and how this budget is really spent, on what it's spent. So this is a much more complicated issue than just about money.
The debate about money the last few months, I guess, was symbolic of some tensions within the alliance, and some questions about whether the new administration here in Washington, with the More than America First position, would have a different view of NATO. Of course, there were those comments, I think, during the transition about NATO being obsolete, that word being used. At the same time, in Europe, you've got Brexit. Dare I bring up that phrase and that word? But do you think there's a shift? And we heard the German Chancellor talk about perhaps Europe needs to take on more of the responsibility itself. That there was a sense that perhaps with Britain moving out of Europe, the EU might take on more of a role, and also with perhaps the transatlantic alliance not being what it was. Is there some big kind of tectonic shift, do you think, going on at the moment, or is it just a bit of politics at the moment? Let's go for you.
For me, the Chancellor said that in the light of the G7 and the NATO meetings recently, but it was above all a wake-up call for the Europeans, not to rely too much on allies, but to take the fate of Europe in its own hands. And I think she had said it before. But if you relate that to defense, it's also true. Europe has to do more, not in competition with NATO, but in addition or in sync with NATO. And we can have so much more bang, let's say big bang for the buck, if we synchronize, if we harmonize our defense effort. It doesn't make sense to have 19 different infantry vehicle systems or 29 different systems for helicopters flying in NATO. We can, elicit synergies if we cooperate better. German and French new President Macron, German Chancellor, got together the other day, and they decided on a couple of common defense armament procurement projects. This is the way to go. And I think Europe can deliver much better for NATO if it gets its act together.
Piotr, I wonder from Poland's perspective, NATO is the central part of the military alliance more than the EU, I'm imagining, in terms of the way it thinks about its defense and security.
Well, as far as defense and security is concerned, for various reasons, it's NATO first, I would say. And going back to obsolete, I think you should forget this word. This word was, I think, a part of negotiations. President Trump was negotiating. He all the time negotiates. So now we have this Brussels speech and the Warsaw speech. So I think the word obsolete no longer exists in this.
To put pressure on ahead of the negotiations.
Putting pressure, but again,
and it worked to some extent.
It worked. I mean, he said in Warsaw it worked. I don't know details, but he knows. I'm sure that it's really worked. Going back to what is more important, as I said, as far as defense, security is concerned, we concentrate on cooperation with NATO, and this is the priority.
Also for NATO, a lot of these new challenges, like cyber, like hybrid warfare, information warfare, don't necessarily sit that easily within the military alliance. They kind of cross over into the civilian world. That's a bit of a challenge. And do you think some of them sit more easily with the EU or in different formats than necessarily NATO?
First of all, one of the big changes, I think, is that there is unanimity, political unanimity between EU and NATO to cooperate much more than before. This is also a result of the changed security situation. It was particularly highlighted at the Warsaw Summit. We have a list of 42 concrete areas of cooperation which I won't go through now.
Thank you.
But it includes cyber, it includes terrorism, it's about the defense posture and so on. This is very, very much consensual, and I think this particularly pertains to hybrid and cyber threats. For instance, the EU established a hybrid fusion cell about a year ago, and we now did the same in my division, and we will cooperate particularly intensely with each other and exchange analyses. We can't really exchange intelligence documents for political reasons, but we can talk about them and exchange analyses on hybrid threats, on cyber threats, and I think this will be very important for both of us.
One of the main sources of tension with Russia has been about NATO expansion. I mean, the Russian view, as I'm sure people will be aware, is that this was a betrayal of promises. It's a plot to surround Russia, to put troops on and military systems on Russia's border. Obviously, there's a view from many NATO member countries that this is actually, it's vital to bring these countries and bring more countries into NATO and to offer them the kind of security guarantees that involves. But there is also a view that perhaps the open door policy has also created a bit of instability in some countries, that often having talks about bringing in countries to NATO perhaps, and whether it was Ukraine, whether it was Georgia, the possibility has created an incentive in turn for Russia to try and destabilize those countries, to try and act, to try and do things, to push aggressively. Do you think, I mean, Arndt, I think you've just been in Ukraine, haven't you, and had talks with them about this. They're starting to make these noises about, roadmaps towards membership. I think we all can imagine how Russia might react to that possibility. Where do you think this policy of expansion lies?
Yeah, I think enlargement is a very complicated policy at the moment, and it basically pertains to two regions, the Western Balkans and Eastern Europe. And I think the reasons are very different. And remind you that we have just taken up a new member, so clearly enlargement is not at its end. It's Montenegro, and there was an attempted putsch just 8 months ago.
Yeah, the Russians tried to disrupt
obviously that. They don't like that at all, and we expect a lot of resistance and meddling of the Russians in the Western Balkans. There are a number of countries which are potential members, and we will work with them. And their difficulties are of very different natures. For instance, Macedonia, there's the name issue, there's a lot of internal problems. Serbia, Bosnia, links with Russia are very strong, and so on. Ukraine, indeed, the NATO Council just visited Kiev, which is something they rarely do. It's quite a big trip, so this was meant to be as a sign of solidarity and of concrete cooperation. For instance, we helped them defending against cyber attacks by giving them advice and also technical means and so on. Yes, President Poroshenko, I think, is pushing the issue of NATO membership more than before. It didn't get a clear response from the Council, and clearly this is due to the situation in eastern Ukraine.
Views on expansion?
Well, I think Arndt said it right. We have to deal with that on a case-by-case basis. Every candidate, so to speak, or every country who wants to join is different. And I think in general, if we take Article 5 seriously, I mean, there are at least two preconditions for new members. First, that the population of that country endorses that membership wholeheartedly. In other words, that there is a sound majority of people supporting it in that country. And secondly, that they don't bring a baggage of unresolved territorial conflicts into NATO that then might drag NATO into a conflict that we don't want to have. And I think it is prudent to look at each country on its merits.
Although arguably the second condition some people fear has created an incentive for Russia to create unresolved conflicts and frozen conflicts over various regions in order to prevent membership. So it's again that point of the Russia is clearly pretty active in trying to prevent that expansion. We'll come to questions from the floor in just one moment. Let me just ask one more quick question to our panel. How worried are each of you about the possibility of some kind of conflict emerging with Russia? Whether it's a Russian, some kind of hybrid, undercover, perhaps semi-undercover incursion into the Baltics, or whether it's we've had all these kind of jets flying very close to each other and some kind of escalation through something like that leading to confrontation. I mean, should we be worried? How worried are each of you?
I think we should be worried because, first of all, because of military exercises. That we remember that military exercises or drills preceded invasion in Georgia and later in Ukraine. And now in 2017, in September, we are expecting a huge military drill in Belarus, Zapad 2017. And because of lack of transparency, we really don't know very much about that. And this is a danger, first of all, for Ukraine, like from both sides, but also for other countries. So it's a potential danger. I'm not saying that anything will happen, especially any attack or provocation against a NATO country, but still there is this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, obviously associated with Zapad.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, I don't know a NATO nation which expects in the short term a military aggression by Russia on a NATO country. But there is a risk of an accident, as you were saying, of miscalculation, of course. And there's the hybrid and cyber spectrum where we don't, attacks like that happen all the time. They are under the threshold of a response so far. So I think, as I said before, this is a very important area to kind of develop a policy of responsiveness of NATO, also as an element of deterrence.
I agree, we must be vigilant. We are not back to the Cold War, luckily. But we face some threats and dangers. All the more important it is to keep the channels with Russia open, to have fora in which the military speaks to each other. We have fora where NATO members speak to Russia, like the NATO-Russian Council. The leaders should speak to each other. And we should not deteriorate into a situation where there's speechlessness. So we are a big promoters of that sort of double-track approach, deterrence and dialogue.
Great. Thank you all. I've got questions, so I'm going to go in this order across here. If you could wait for the microphone, identify your name and any affiliation, and a brief question. Thank you.
Jakob Schröder, I work for the Intelligence Committee of the German Parliament. First of all, on Ambassador Wittig's notion that endorsing NATO is a precondition for joining NATO, if that's the case, I'm a bit worried about my own country's NATO membership. The second point, I'd like to come back to Article 5 and hybrid threats again. We make a very big deal of the 4 battalions that are stationed on our eastern flank. I wonder whether that is a good reason to say that we have invested a lot in deterrence. If Russia conducts a hybrid operation against one of the eastern states and it is not Article 5, and we determine it's not Article 5 or we can't agree on it, if little green men capture a town hall and the NATO Council can't unanimously agree that the 4 battalions will have any kind of use, they have to be in their bases, then NATO is not doing anything. On the other hand, if there's a serious conventional threat, 4 battalions will be of no use, well, perhaps for a couple of hours until they are overrun. So from my perspective, the only reason why we have stationed 4 battalions is to make sure that if there is a serious aggression from Russia, enough people die from other NATO member states so that we have no chance but invoke Article 5. And perhaps the ambassador of Poland would like to correct me, but that was my perception why Poland only accepted America as the framework nation to Poland, because that's the only country that Poland accepts as a credible source of if enough Americans die, then there will be a defense to Poland. Perhaps it's a bit cynical, but my question is whether you would share that comment, which of course you will not officially, but perhaps you could elaborate a bit. And second of all, again, what is NATO specifically doing if we have a hybrid threat scenario, again, a Baltic states country, like in Ukraine, we cannot anonymously agree on Article 5. What are we specifically doing to help a small country like Lithuania, like Latvia, to protect its territorial integrity? Thank you.
Who wants to go first?
So I will start just with this question about America or NATO. There is no alternative, the United States or NATO. It's as you know, the deployment is both US and NATO, and of course the United States is our most important military ally, but at the same time NATO is even more important because it's larger than the United States. So I don't see any problem here or just any reason to make difference between NATO deployment and US deployment.
Yeah, what are we specifically doing? First of all, it's absolutely crucial to improve our situational awareness or our understanding of what goes on. So we have developed extremely close ties with the framework nations, the participating nations, and all the host nations. There's really a very well operating network of exchange of information there. Now, if something happened, it would be a political decision to be taken at the NATO Council, and that would depend very much on exactly what would happen. But the linchpin is to understand the situation well and to be able to attribute it.
Well, I would just add, why are we there with a battalion in each of those countries? Because we have skin, we have skin in the game. That's the whole point. We don't think a battalion can prevent an incursion of Russia, but it is a sign that whole NATO has skin in this game. And another point, we were mindful not to discard the NATO-Russian Act of 1997. And we didn't want to sort of overshoot and give a pretext to Russia, then to arm in an outstanding way or mass in an outstanding way forces at the border there. So it was a calibrated measure, but I think it was a pretty strong message, and it means a lot. I think for the posture, the fact that we have our soldiers there, American, Canadian, British, German soldiers in those countries, means it sends out a strong signal of solidarity.
Maybe one addition, if I may, and we do a lot to strengthen resilience of NATO members and also partners, and that's absolutely crucial for hybrid and cyber attacks. That's a big part of our engagement.
Okay, I had a question here in the middle.
Good afternoon. I'm Drew Dornsteiner. I'm a foreign area officer in the Army, and I'm an Aspen scholar. Gordon, you brought up the example of the British exit from the European Union, and that's a credible example of a long-standing membership being challenged by a fracture. Are you concerned about any members of NATO pursuing some similar separation? And if so, where? Do you think it's realistic, and what do you want to do about it?
Absolutely not concerned. Very simple answer. No, nobody seems to be thinking of that, thankfully. It's not a scenario that I deem in any way realistic.
I suppose the interesting question is Turkey is a NATO member, and Turkey is heading in a different direction to one that it was in the past. I think most people accept that. I think I saw recently that it's in talks about buying a Russian air defense system, the S-400, which is kind of interesting for a NATO country to be purchasing. Can you imagine a scenario in which, I mean, it's difficult for you all to talk about membership, but that could become an issue in the future, I suppose, is my question. I'm not sure if anyone wants to comment on that. That would be my observation.
in the future. I mean, the only thing I would like to mention here is that Turkey is, from our perspective, a very important NATO member, and there is actually a very useful format, Poland has with Romania and Turkey, and we have meetings on various levels quite often, like members of this big members of this eastern flank of NATO, and it's mostly about NATO and about defense. The situation of Turkey is extremely difficult. It's a NATO member, but also their situation in the region is very, very challenging. So it's very difficult to evaluate what they do, because they are in the middle of the crisis, I would say, nowadays.
I agree with that. Just to add, extremely important member, extremely important for this challenge from the south.
Yeah.
An important contributor to the capabilities of NATO. They're going through a very difficult phase of their domestic development. We have a complicated bilateral relationship, as other countries have, but no desire to push Turkey out of NATO.
Question over here.
Yes, my name's Guy Swan. I'm a vice president at the Association of the U.S. Army. As a retired Army officer, I spent a lot of time in Europe as a NATO officer, largely during the Cold War days, and it struck me that the alliance has doubled in size since I was serving there, and the modern half, the new members, are all virtually from the East, largely speaking. And my point is about burden sharing from Ambassador Wittig. When I speak to American commanders, some of whom you've talked about, units that are over in the eastern part of the alliance, they seem to think that the 2% military spending, GDP military spending, should be measured differently, perhaps, in terms of perhaps infrastructure. I hear this a lot because of the Soviet period in the East, perhaps not as advanced infrastructure as you have in Western Europe, that maybe that burden sharing could be recalibrated in terms of ports, railroads, things that have a military usage, dual usage with civilian infrastructure, but not necessarily direct military spending. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's an interesting thought. I know there have been discussions to broaden sort of the character of the contributions, include, for instance, financial contributions to stabilization measures, or to even include measures to fight migration or things like that. That's a controversial discussion, but in general, I would welcome, as the challenge of NATO becomes more broad-based and includes even non-military measures. You might also want to think about whatever the number then is, whether it's then 2% or maybe higher, that you include in that ratio also other elements. I think that's an interesting thought.
Okay, more questions. One here, please.
Thank you very much, Steve Shapiro, director with BENS and also with the Atlantic Council. And just a few weeks ago, I had the privilege of being in Warsaw for the combined global forum that the Atlantic Council puts on with the Polish Institute of International Affairs. And General Ben Hodges, Commander, U.S. Army Europe, made a similar point, Guy, to yours, which was a terrific point. And related to that is a question that he raised, and so essentially on his behalf, I would raise it to you. Given that the NATO forces, particularly on the eastern flank, are so few and literally far between, they're dispersed throughout many different countries, he says he's got a terribly difficult time moving around and getting his forces together, whereas Russia has pretty well free hand given Belarus and its own large territory. And as a result, he's calling for something called what she refers to as a military Schengen zone. He finds it quite difficult to move his knight in response to the other guy's knight or rook, given the actual bureaucratic problems that he faces within Europe. Road weight limits for tanks, nighttime force moving restrictions for his forces, noise restrictions, prior advance notice requirements, which are in some cases weeks for him to move his forces around. So particularly being concerned about the effects that a Zapad exercise might end up in the speed and rapidity and speed and rapidness with which the Russians can move their forces, he says he's completely unable to get there. He can't demonstrate resolve even on a show basis, given these what he calls bureaucratic restrictions. And I wonder if some thought is given to a system-wide, NATO-wide provision that provides some discretion to a commander to move about a bit more freely so that NATO can exercise some muscle a little better. Thank you.
That's for Arndt.
Interesting thought. I'm not aware that this is being discussed in the military circles. Could be, but I would like to mention that one of the big decisions in 2014 already was not only the enhanced forward presence and tailored forward presence, but also the NATO response force, and that was then beefed up at the Warsaw summit to comprise 40,000 troops. And the idea of that is to complement these relatively small forward presences, which are essentially a tripwire, you might call them, and make sure that substantial troops can be moved to come to their help in a matter of a few days. And there's one element, which is the VJTF, the very high readiness response force, which can be redeployed within a matter of few days. So these are some models that have already been developed and could potentially be expanded.
Great. I think I had another question over here.
Yes, thank you. My name is Michael Zakroff. I'm with Sphere Strategies. Where did the 2% of GDP number come from, and is it remotely adequate?
Thank you. Well, I'm not quite sure where it came from at the time. I think it preceded the Wales summit. It was a figure already developed at an earlier stage, but there was a feeling in Wales in 2014 that this should carry more meaning. We need a greater commitment to that. The whole discussion today is about what does that really mean in terms of capabilities, and this was already echoed by some of you. And there's an appreciation that was also formalized at the special meeting of heads of state and government on the 25th of May in Brussels with President Trump, which speaks not only about 2% spending, but also about the necessity of capabilities and contributions, i.e. Operations. So that part is not controversial. But I think there are many questions attached to it, one of them being that every country measures defense spending in a different way. So it's actually quite difficult to compare these spending contributions.
We are nearly out of time. I have one more question here.
I'm coming.
My name is John Lowe. My name is John Lowe. I was the ambassador to Denmark in 1981 to 1983. The issue of getting Denmark to put up 2% was an endless conversation. course, with them, it was an endless conversation also about nuclear weapons. But this is, and I congratulate the ambassador from Poland that you are 2%. I'm not clear again why Germany, who is by far the most powerful and richest country, and whom the relations with our president and Angela Merkel are very delicate, it seems, why, to make everybody happy, wouldn't Germany go to 2%? I noticed in a list somewhere that it's not nearly 2%. Mm-hmm. It's under.
Yeah.
What is the actual percentage that Germany?
A couple of thoughts on this. First of all, I explained that we're moving to 2% in a decade. Second thought, we come from a period where we thought we have to reap our peace dividend. After the fall of the wall, our army was drawn down from 500,000 to, I think now, 270,000. That was the spirit of the age. Russia is a partner, and the threat, the territorial threat from the east is no longer there. That changed in 2014, and so far this was a game-changing moment. One more thought, because of our past, we have an army. Many people in the 50s, many Germans thought we would never, ever have an army again after the Nazis. But NATO came, invited us, and that was part and parcel of our security to join NATO. We have an army that is constitutionally a parliamentary army. We cannot deploy a single soldier outside NATO without a mandate from Parliament. That is a total difference from a presidential system like in the US. And we need a budget. And we need, for every euro that we want to increase our budget, the parliamentary approval. So you have to bring the population along and the parliamentarians if you want to increase that budget. Now, it is a leadership issue. The chancellor, the foreign minister, the defense minister have to make their case that the parliament raises the budget. But this is not self-evident. This is not self-evident that people go along. So that's a domestic restriction. And we have a harder time to elicit support from this kind of measure than the president, who can just do like this. So, every country has its own history, where we come from. We have a post-Second World War pacifist tradition, a very strong pacifist streak in our population. I think the one who understands that best is General Mattis. He has a lot of experience with NATO allies. He knows the NATO allies, where they come from, what is possible and feasible for them, and we have a friend in him who understands the difficulties that we are challenged with for this goal.
Peter, Wittig, thank you very much. I think that is all we have time for, so thank you to the three ambassadors in our panel. Thank you.